Michelle and Zoe, first impressions of Canberra in the last few weeks. Michelle?
Hi everyone. So thank you to the organisers for tonight. It's really an honour and a delight to be here in such an intimate forum, and I hope it's interactive and you cannot offend me. It's impossible. So first impressions of Canberra, right? Look, when I go to Canberra, for me it's all about wonder. I'm literally pinching myself everywhere I go. I look around and I don't think I will ever lose that sense of wonder that I'm here, and you know, it's a sense also there's a juxtaposition of permanence and impermanence. The permanence being the idea of Australia, this glittering democracy that will prevail no matter what, and the impermanence being me. I'm just passing through. And as the Prime Minister said, you know, you have a choice. You can either depart with regret or you can depart with pride. And I intend to make it the latter. The other things I would say is that I've had to learn a whole new language. So I've gone from one secret language where we use words like infarction, extracorporeal, and maculopapula, to another language of things like division, porrogation, and cognate debate. I am reading the standing orders. So you know, that's been a real step change. And then finally, the impact on my family. I think of my parents actually. So about 2 weeks ago, tomorrow I gave my maiden speech, and it turns out my mum and dad, you know, they sit by the TV and they watch it maybe 3 times a week with their babies, and they have a great time. So I think it's actually given my family a lot of pride.
Look, I had to draw a mud map from the front door to my office for the first little while. Parliament House is quite challenging to get around when you don't know it, and also because it's mirrored, you can sometimes get quite confused about where you are or which direction you're facing. So there are some functional aspects to that, and also the standing orders and the language of the Parliament is something very different, even for me as a journalist of some decades. I would say that it reminds me of being on a 24/7 breaking news story. The whole time you're there, you're on, and things unfold very quickly, so you have to be able to respond very rapidly and absorb information fast and try and figure out what the best position on that is for your community. So it's an evolving process for me, just figuring out how that works. I do think, having been there for the first sitting for a couple of weeks, it was a really positive experience, because finally I was able to see that intersection of what was happening in my community of Goldstein and what happens in the Parliament, and how to bring those two things together in terms of advocating to ministers on various issues that are really important to our community, but also having input, direct input into legislation on the really important issues that I campaigned on. So that was actually a really good thing, to be able to realise how those two things fit together.
Thank you. And to the old-timers sitting down there. Josh, the only Jewish Josh to hang on. What a nail biter. You made it.
Thanks, Gabby. So there's a few things to say. First of all, good evening, everyone, and thank you to the JCCV and Zionism MPs for putting on a good evening. If I'm giving feedback, I can move a little bit. That made it worse. And yeah, so thank you everyone for coming tonight. It was extraordinary. I mean, democracy is brutal, and it's hard work, and everyone who's on stage would have experienced that, and all of their staff and all of the volunteers on all sides of politics. And yeah, in Macnamara we were the 76th seat, which was 10. We found out, and Anthony Green called it 10 days after the election finished. And despite what some of my staff might say, I maintained calmness throughout that. I was a Zen master. But no, it was brutal. But it's also beautiful that people can express themselves and put forward ideas about how they want to make the country better, And it was a contest of ideas, and I think that the Greens ran a really strong campaign, and they gave me a run for their money, but we prevailed, and now we have the responsibility of government. And I'll just say one more thing. There were good people who lost their seats at the last election, and people who've been friends of the Jewish community. Tim in Goldstein was a good friend of the Jewish community and still is, and of course Josh, and Dave and others in Sydney, but Josh especially, Josh Frydenberg. When I first became an MP, Josh reached out and was really kind and didn't need to be, and he wrote he and I wrote a joint op-ed on Holocaust education, and Josh I think always never tried to play politics with the Jewish community. He always sought to do things together, and I think that's why an evening like tonight is so important, because it's not really about us. It's about ensuring that no matter who's on stage, no matter who is in this role, no matter who has the temporary aspect of this job, that the Jewish community has certainty, and it doesn't matter who's in government. It's our job as MPs, I think, to work across the aisle to ensure that for the Jewish community, and Josh did, and I acknowledge it.
Senator Paterson, I'm going to refer you as James.
You can, please.
Thank you.
You make me call you Senator.
That's special dispute.
Right.
You're an old McKinnon Secondary College boy, and so you grew up surrounded by a big Jewish population at school. How has that, if at all, shaped where you are now?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Gabby, thank you. Like a lot of people, I have a tiny little bit of Jewish heritage myself, and although I don't identify as Jewish, I do identify very strongly with the Jewish community, partly because I know I have that family history, and partly because I grew up in the Jewish community. I've probably been to as many bar mitzvahs as you all have. And studying at McKinnon was a great opportunity to learn more about the Jewish community and to develop a really strong affinity to it. Travelling to Israel as a student at university was a very powerful experience for me, and really reaffirmed for me my instinctive support for the people of Israel. But actually the most profound experience that affected my outlook on the Middle East or on the Jewish community was visiting Europe. It was being in Berlin and visiting the Holocaust Museum. It was being in the Czech Republic, in Prague, and visiting the Jewish Museum there. It was being in Vienna and visiting the Jewish Quarter, the so-called Jewish Quarter, where there are no Jews left today, and reading the stories of Jewish families that fled Spain in the 15th and 16th century for Europe to find freedom and safety and community, who were then wiped out in the Holocaust. And that really reaffirmed for me why Israel is important, and why I have an important responsibility to stand with the Jewish community and do everything I can to protect the Jewish community, because the sad truth is all racism is evil, but there's a particularly deep and old sickness in humanity of anti-Semitism. And those of us who have the opportunity in public life to fight it, to keep it at bay, to protect the Jewish community, must uphold that opportunity.
Might use that opportunity then to segue to talking a bit about anti-Semitism, because it is real. And as much as even the most optimistic amongst us would like to be, it's alive and well. I was with my family last night at the football, and there was an incident on the train. Sometimes I like to pretend it just doesn't, it's not as bad as everyone says, but it actually really is. We know that Victoria was the first state to introduce a ban on the Nazi swastika, and other states are following suit to introduce cognate legislation. One of the issues, though, in our federal system is that the states are unable to control material that's published online, particularly if the server's located overseas. So you've expressed support for companion federal legislation to ban the online display of Nazi swastikas, including the blocking of offending websites and web pages, but you've urged some caution to to avoid unintended consequences and to allow for the use of such material in carefully managed educational settings. I was wondering if you could expand on what you mean by that qualification.
Well, only really what the qualification is in the state legislation, in part, because we know that other religious groups use the swastika, so there are exemptions in the state legislation. But I also do think that in an educational context, when we're trying to teach our children about the Holocaust, there has to be an honesty in that process of education. So that's where I think that honesty needs to occur. But I have spoken out about the fact that I have deep concern about free speech and hate speech being equated with each other. They're not equivalent. And I think that we do have a problem across the world with hate speech online being allowed to prosper, and with difficulties in cracking down on that. And having covered the Trump administration and seen and reported on the increase in neo-Nazism, the rise in instances of anti-Semitism, and spent a lot of time talking to members of the Jewish community in the US, this is a festering problem. And even in Australia, we've seen Holocaust denialism sit online for years, with authorities being unable to remove it or crack down on it because of the limitations within legislation. So this is the world in which we live. I don't think we can pretend that that's not happening. And I think given that the states are starting to move on this, I think there's an opportunity for the federal government to come in behind that and to fill the gaps that the state legislation can't.
I should add, if anyone wants to jump in, anyone on the panel that wants to jump in, there will be time for questions. But in relation to the questions that I'm asking, if anyone wants to, feel free to jump in. Israel. Let's talk about Israel. Josh, recently Prime Minister Albanese spoke with Israel's Prime Minister Lapid, and they agreed to deepen cooperation. In which areas do you think there's opportunity for that closer cooperation between Israel and Australia to be forged?
Great question. And I might also hand over to my research specialist on the other side of the panel to, because it's something Michelle and I have spoken about, and Michelle can speak about it with a real authority. But first of all, it is worth making the point that Prime Minister Albanese and Prime Minister Lapid, two people who have come into the job relatively recently, did speak, and from my discussion with Anthony, it was a really good conversation and one that he was really pleased with. And it also followed the first piece of correspondence from the incoming government to President Herzog to reaffirm that long-standing relationship between Australia and Israel. So I think that the first point, and the reason why I say that is because there needs to be stability in the relationship, and there needs to be that predictability between Israel and Australia. And I think that that's a responsibility that we, as an incoming Labor government, just as when Doc Everett was in the United Nations in 1947, that we, as a Labor Party and as a Labor government, take that responsibility seriously. Beyond that, and I might let Michelle speak about research, but the Victorian government has actually done some really good work around biomedicine, and actually having trade offices in Tel Aviv around biomedicine. There are things that Israel is doing that is just at the forefront, and that comes with a culture of investment in science and innovation, and a real sense of risk, and connecting politics with entrepreneurship. And I think it's actually something that we don't do very well in Australia, that we don't think as much as we need to from an entrepreneur perspective. We often think about it from a regulatory perspective. And that's something that I think Israel has the edge over us. Beyond that, maybe Michelle might want to add to it.
Look, I think Israel is an innovation world leader. It is the exemplar of the startup nation, and there is a lot that Australia can learn from Israel. In my previous life, I was a researcher at Monash. I was an associate professor, and I was a clinical director of a medtech entity at Monash, which was focused on basically commercializing tech, and my interest was in AI. And it became pretty clear to me pretty quickly that Israel was the go-to country, right, for Australia to learn from. And, Australia produces incredible research, but we are very, very bad at commercialising it. It is way too hard for our PhDs and our early and mid-career researchers, some of whom may be here, to actually cross that valley of death and commercialise. And when you look at the OECD, data on R&D, right, and this is widely available, you can Google it, you'll see that the country that is number one for R&D is actually Israel. So around 5.4% of their GDP is devoted to research. The second country is South Korea at about 4.8%. The OECD average is about 2.6%. The US sits at about 3.4%, all right? So we think 3% is about the minimum benchmark. Australia's contribution to R&D is 1.8%. And the trajectory for Israel is like this, number one, right? In the OECD, a club of 38 rich countries. South Korea is like this, United States is like this, but it's still going up. Australia is like this, right? We peaked in 2010 and we've been on the decline since then. So this is a really important opportunity. We are in government now. Every lever that can be pulled must be pulled to halt this decline. And I am not a big fan of more bureaucracy. I am not a big fan in death by committee or death by review. We don't need another review into R&D and what's going wrong in Australia. All we need to do is look to Israel, because the blueprint is already there for how we innovate our way out of this crisis.
Can I just jump in and add one more thing on the bilateral relationship, which I really hope the Albanese government is able to continue, is our previous Trade Minister, Dan Tehan, put a free trade agreement with Israel on the table on the medium-term agenda. Now, understandably, the government want to secure agreements that are already in process, like the European Union free trade agreement. That's obviously a very important priority. But once items like that are ticked off, I really hope a bilateral free trade agreement with Israel is possible. Might require a little bit more political stability in Israel to have a partner to sign it with, but if we're able to get that, it will be a real game changer for the relationship, because Michelle and Josh are right, there's so many areas for cooperation, whether it's in agriculture, water, environment, technology, cyber security, so many things that we could cooperate better with Israel and closer with Israel, and it would be enriching for both our countries.
James, to stay with you, last October, the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security recommended the Morrison government consider listing Hamas in its entirety as a terrorist organisation. You were the chair of that committee, the membership of which ceased when the House of Reps was dissolved in April this year. What's happened to that recommendation?
Well, good news. Not only is Hamas now listed in its entirety as a terrorist organisation, as opposed to just previously the Al-Qassam brigades of Hamas, but also the entirety of Hezbollah is now listed, whereas opposed to previously it was just the external security organisation. So while I chaired the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security, we recommended to the government that both of those listings be broadened, and the government agreed with our recommendation and got both of those done. Now that is a decade-long project between the Parliament, particularly the Intelligence Committee and the Jewish community, and it was outstanding advocacy from the peak organisations in the Jewish community who gave very compelling evidence to the committee, but also international experts and others who really made the point in the case of both Hezbollah and Hamas that this distinction that we previously drew between their military or so-called terrorist wings on the other hand and their so-called civilian or political wings on the other was a fiction, an entirely false distinction, which even Hamas and Hezbollah themselves said was a meaningless distinction. And yet for too long in our policy settings, it was a distinction that was upheld. So I'm really pleased that that was done. There are some very serious ramifications which flow from that. There has been a big debate in this country and elsewhere in the world about recognising Palestinian statehood. Well, if you were to do that, you would now be recognising a terrorist entity as part of that. So I think we need to think very carefully about the implications of doing so.
It's definitely complex. Zoe, last Sunday, the Israeli Prime Minister and Palestinian Islamic Jihad announced a ceasefire after 3 days of fighting, the kind of thing you used to cover. By that time, about 50 Palestinians had been killed and 360 injured. About 70 Israelis had been injured by that time. Residential and other civilian structures had been damaged. The conflict involved 147 airstrikes by Israeli Defence Force against targets in Gaza, and about 1,100 rockets and mortars launched by Palestinian Islamic Jihad into Israel. We know that about 200 of those rockets landed inside of the Gaza Strip. And being the nerd that I am, did a bit of reading before tonight. The UN Security Council noted that there was evidence proving that the deaths of children in Gavalia were the result of Palestinian Islamic Jihad rockets. It's complex. What role does Australia play, Zoe, if any, in the ebbs and flows of that conflict? Not only between Israel and the Palestinian territories, but between Israel and her other neighbours.
Well, I think Josh said it actually, that it's about stability of the position. And we know that both major parties in Australia have in effect the same position on safety, security in both Israel and the Palestinian territories. That's a position that I share. I think that as a group of politicians sitting here, we have limited capacity to have any impact whatsoever on what's happening in that conflict. But the capacity that we do have is to listen to our community and the feelings in this community about what's going on, and then to take that forward in various forms of advocacy within the Parliament. I mean, I'm sure everyone in this room would hope that at some point we can get past the sort of behaviour that has happened over the last couple of weeks. It's just repeat trauma for everyone involved. But I think the stability of the policy position from an Australian perspective is important in terms of safety and security, but then also that ability to have those other kinds of relationships that we're talking about in terms of our relationship with Israel in regard to trade, in regard to business interests and all sorts of other interactions that we have that sit, I think, outside the conflict.
Kevin, can I add something to that?
Absolutely.
I mean, so it is difficult as Australian MPs to be running commentary on international conflicts because we are representative of the Australian community. But I do want to make this observation that thank goodness for the Iron Dome defence system, because without it, these 3-day conflicts wouldn't be 3-day conflicts. It would have escalated so much more, and to be able to have that just extra layer of protection from Israel's point of view does mean that it was limited to a 3-day conflict. Now, like every single loss of life needs to be recognised. Every single loss of life. And I think that's something inherent within the Jewish community, that we do value life and we respect all life. But the fact that this was limited compared to other conflicts, which sounds sort of a bit sort of awful to say, is better than not. And I also think that some of the commentary coming out of Israel's leadership of ensuring that there was consequence for firing rockets into major civilian areas, because for goodness sake, there were rockets firing over Melbourne right now, there would be a pretty harsh response, one would think. No one blinked an eye when the United States took out the head of Al-Qaeda. But putting that aside, the fact that Israel was able to respond and then projected that they wanted to stop the conflict as soon as possible, I think was important. And I think it's important for Israel diplomatically, and I think it was a smart move by the Israelis as well.
I'm going to move the conversation on only because I have no doubt there'll be more questions about Israel later, and there's more ground to cover. Michelle, constitutional recognition of First Nations peoples, where are we at? Is it going to happen? And what can the Jewish community do to get behind it?
constitutional recognition of First Nations people is a priority for our country. This is the unfinished business of our nation. Australia is in three parts, and I'm paraphrasing Noel Pearson. You would have all heard this. The ancient land, the ancient culture of our First Nations people spanning 65,000 years. The British settlement, which anchored British institutions into ancient soil. Our Parliament, for example, the Westminster system. And then finally, the multicultural triumph of modern Australia, and I'm part of that, and I'm proud to be part of that. But our Commonwealth is not in union. There is this underlying longing and pain in our nation because we have not empowered our First Nations people. Now the Jewish people, this will resonate with you. Our First Nations people, we think, are around 800,000 in our country, of 25 million. They are a minority. The Jewish people, about 100,000 in our country, right? So you are an extreme minority, and it is incredibly hard to be heard when there are so many other competing demands and voices, and demands on the attention of politicians, to be honest. We're at a point now where our First Nations people need to be empowered. We need to take the empowerment out of the hands of the politicians and put it into our First Nations people so that they can stand up in Parliament and tell us what they think. And then it's up to us as legislators to act on their behalf. Now, this is something we're going to get done in this term. I am absolutely determined that Higgins will get this over the line, and I think they will. So I would urge all of you to back this cause. It is a worthy cause, and you know, the Uluru Statement was already 5 years ago. So how much longer are we going to wait? And how many more lives will be lost in that time unless we get this done?
I just want to add something to that. I fear that, like a lot of things in recent history in this country, that this will become fodder for a culture war. I think it's very dangerous. And I think it's incumbent on all of us to talk to those that we know about what this actually is, what it represents, and the fact that this is a moment in time that will not come back. If we miss this opportunity, we may not get it back again for several decades. So I will be, and certainly my volunteer cohort and my staff and myself will be actively working on education campaigns on this issue to reassure people about what the voice actually means, how that fits within our parliamentary system, and why we need it now.
Well, the only thing I'd add to those two really good responses was the Jewish community has had a long affinity with our First Nations people. From the time when William Cooper in 1938 marched from the Australian Aborigines League from Footscray to the German High Commission in the city and tried to deliver a letter of protest to the late great Ron Caston in the Mabo decision. Mark Liebler was central to the design of the Reconciliation Project. The Jewish community has always been a part of First Nations reconciliation in this country, and I think that it absolutely is a cause that the Jewish community should help deliver. And just imagine for 1 second waking up in an Australia where we actually get this passed. And think about what that's going to feel like the day after the referendum, knowing that we actually, as a country, made a decision to give people a voice and to give the oldest living continuous culture on this planet a voice enshrined in the very document that defines what our country is. That's a really powerful thing, and I think waking up in that Australia, it might mean some hard conversations, but I think that that's a good Australia and one worth fighting for, and I absolutely think that the Jewish community should be a part of that.
Trying to think which topic I want to follow up with. I reread Gen 17 for extra nerdiness over the weekend. It's 5 years old now, so it's a survey of demographics in the Jewish community, and it's a really important document and needs updating, obviously, because of census, the latest census data. But what struck me was what we already know, that relative to the general Australian population, Jews have above average levels of educational qualification and above average incomes, although there is also, to quote, significant pockets of poverty. In fact, the survey went on to say that, and I'm quoting here, a clearer and potentially more important relationship was found between feelings of financial insecurity and age. The survey also found that more than 1 in 20 members of the Jewish community had personally reduced their food or prescription medication in the previous 12 months because they couldn't afford it, and it was most prevalent in Victoria rather than New South Wales, and it was more prevalent amongst female Jews than male. That was 5 years ago, before interest rates were rising, before the cost of living is what it is now. The Jewish community is not immune from the pressures that the wider community is experiencing, and it would be remiss of us not to recognise it. Josh, starting with you, what's the solution?
Right, you just start with me then.
Picking on you, I'm just...
Thanks, Gary. No, I think you touch on some really big trends in our economy. I mean, you know, if you're a young person, right, if you're an 18-year-old and you're about to enter into the workforce, you know, you stop and think about, well, what's your working life going to be? What are you going to show for it? You're more likely than ever to be in a casualised job. You're more likely than ever to not be able to afford a home, to get into the housing market. If you're a woman, you're more likely to have lower pay than your male counterparts, as well as to work in feminised industries. Your superannuation, if you're a woman, is more likely to be lower than that of your male counterparts. I think there are some real economic challenges. It's why we're seeing the fastest growing cohort of people in Australia is women over 55. You know, the average homeless person isn't you know, sort of the image that people like to throw out. It's like it's older women in Australia. And there are a whole range of economic factors that go into that. So the first thing is I think we need to have an honest conversation about the fact that actually the generation that's following is going to have a really difficult time. And the Australian economy is actually becoming, you know, it's working for fewer and fewer people. And that, you know, government's going to have to bring the community along as they try and deal with some of the things that will hopefully turn that around. I think we at some stage need to have an honest conversation about tax in this country, which hasn't really happened yet. We need to have a real focus on permanent jobs if that's what people want, and wages. Wages have not kept up with the rising cost of inflation. It's a huge problem, and like go and speak to a younger person if you're not experiencing it personally, because I can tell you that is something that is really concerning for younger people in Australia, and especially young Jewish people. Like, how are they meant to afford a home around here? No chance. There's no chance unless they inherit one. So, getting a bit of nodding from my younger friends here. So I'd say there are real problems in the Australian economy. If we do nothing, it will get worse. And hopefully, we can be a part of that conversation to try and turn some of these systemic things around.
Can I make a comment?
Yeah.
I agree with everything Josh has said. There are certain groups in our community who just lack the social protections of others. So Josh has already talked about them. Young people are one, women are another, minority groups are another, and then this kind of cohort of essential workers. And you've seen, that survey you read was, what, 5 years ago? Mm-hmm. So we've seen that the pandemic has exposed the fault lines within society and even between societies, right? And the one fault line is inequality. And the pandemic has just ripped that wide open. So on top of that, we are now facing climate change. And climate change is the threat multiplier. It is going to put even more pressure on our society. And those fault lines will widen even further, and you're already seeing that. You're seeing the communities who are disproportionately being affected by floods, fires, heat waves, even cold snaps. It's usually poor people, it's often women, elderly, young people, people who do not have the financial, the economic reserve to deal with these kinds of threats. So, I mean, I think as a government, it is incumbent upon us to apply, again, not just levers but also dials to raise all boats, basically. So we need to iron out inequality. We need to have a conversation around taxation reform, around housing affordability, around the fact that, maybe we need to think about whether we can accommodate more dwellings on the same sort of footprint, because stretching our cities out further is only going to add to emissions, right? So a whole conversation needs to be had about what kind of Australia we want for the future, and particularly for our younger people.
Bit of microphone feedback. Is there any boffins in here who can fix that? Okay. James?
Yeah, thank you. Just two things I want to add. I want to echo what Josh and Michelle said about home ownership. I think it is the issue for younger Australians, but not only for younger Australians. All the data shows that the ages which you buy your first home is getting later and later, and that's having a profound effect on how people plan and structure their lives. Family formation is happening later, or settling down is happening later, and if that's something that people are doing by choice, then that's completely fine, and that's their right. But if it's something they're doing because they feel that they have to work longer and save more before they can buy a home so they can make those milestone decisions in life, then that's a very sad thing. And I'm particularly conscious to Josh's point about the effect that has on the Jewish community as a small community with a strong sense of identity that has a particularly strong desire to live where possible close together, and how that's becoming harder and harder. And you can see that in those generational reports how the Jewish community is spreading more thinly and in a more dispersed way, and I think housing affordability is a key component of that. The one really note of optimism I would add is that one of the things I most admire about the Jewish community is its strong sense of civil society and philanthropy. If there's a problem somewhere in the world, there's a Jewish community organisation trying to solve it, and they probably have an office upstairs at FYC. And it's just amazing how that strong sense of philanthropy and that obligation, and that sense that, yes, governments of course have a role, and public policy has a role, but communities have a role too, and the way in which the Jewish community steps up and solves problems is so impressive.
It's a great opportunity to talk about climate. Zoe, I want to start with you. Is Joel or Zoe in the audience? He bought a ticket. He bought a ticket, but he didn't show up. Okay. The Jewish Climate Network has committed to try to create a zero emissions community. How can the Jewish community, as part of the wider community, seek to achieve that?
The thing that happened, I think, during particularly this election campaign, and it wasn't just sort of something that happened overnight, obviously it had been building, but a lot of community just switched on to actually doing something, taking action, not sitting back and waiting. And so when it came to the so-called climate election that we just had, I think that was to do with a lot of people in the community stating with their vote, we have to do something about this, we can't wait anymore. Now I've met with the Jewish Climate Action Group, it's a group of young people who are incredibly dynamic and motivated, and that's exactly what we need in our communities to make this change happen. So there's going to be large-scale structural change that this government, thankfully, is already actioning. The climate change bill went through the lower house in the first 2 weeks of Parliament. It is a start, not a finish, but at least we have a target that's legislated as a floor, not a ceiling. But there's going to be all sorts of legislative change to happen now, which I think should create a situation where everything that we do needs to be looked at through the prism of how will it affect the climate before we do it. And I think that's where we'll get to. But what that then enables too is community organisations like the one that you're talking about to step in and say, what can we do in our community? I'm working, for example, with one of the communities in the Electorate on a community battery project. There is a highly motivated group of people who really want to get this up. They're also working on zero waste in a portion of the Electorate. All of these community organisations are doing these individual things. I think what we actually have to get to now that we have a government and a crossbench with the will to do this federally, and also highly motivated state governments, is to bring all these community organisations together so that we can get this large-scale collective action across the country, so that we're not all reinventing the wheel. Every time someone wants to put in a community battery, how do we do it? Where do we start? How do we get the funding? What's the process? We need to start developing systems whereby each community can take that idea off the shelf and implement it. And we will get there, but I think where we are now is a turning point, where we not only have these sorts of groups with the motivation, but we have a series of politicians who are in a position to legislate that also have the motivation and to throw money in the right direction. And that also enables business to then do that too. Because one of the big problems that we've had, of course, has been lack of certainty for business wanting to invest in this area.
Okay. So the climate change bill is probably one of the most important bills that we will pass in this term of government. And I don't want you to underestimate how important this is. Now, this bill, a lot of discussion has been focused on the interim target of 43%. But what this actually means when you unpack it is that Australia is going to go from 33% renewable energy now to 82% in a mere 8 years. So it is a rapid transformation that is going to happen. And what this bill does deliver, as I said, is certainty, right? The constraint is not capital, the constraint has been certainty. So what I would say to the Jewish community, to the high net worth individuals and to the industrialists and the capitalists is think about parking your money in Australia, right? We need investment to help us get to net zero. And to other people here and listening, I would urge you to consider training and being part of this energy transition and transformation that is going to happen. Now, I'm a doctor and I've been a researcher, but I can't fix a damn thing, all right? I can't make a battery, I can't scramble up a wind turbine, I can't lay an underground electric transmission cable. So we are going to need people to make this a reality. The bill has passed and it will come into law, but it is the people who are going to help make this a reality.
So just to translate that, no more doctors and lawyers. Careers counselling at our schools needs to change a little, I'm sure it already has. And all the boobas and zetas out there, stop pressuring your grandchildren to be lawyers and doctors. We want more engineers and scientists. How are we going for time? Questions now? All right, let's go to questions. A couple of rules of engagement. No sermons, no speeches, just questions, please. I will cut you off if you start sermonising. And we are here to engage respectfully. I just ask the audience to remember that. Over to you. Mum, I'm going to... I will get you, Mum. The gentleman in the front.
Ron Rapp here. I feel very sorry for Bill Shorten. Why? Because he actually had a very good policy on housing, I thought. So as I said, I feel sorry for Bill Shorten because I really think he had a very good policy about housing, and I think this is almost a no-brainer. I'd like a reaction. In summary, the idea was to take away the almost obscene profit you can make from being rich and buying more property and playing that whole game and negative gearing and capital gains tax. And But unfortunately, the Australian population didn't want it. They wanted property to be a casino. And I'm asking you, how do you get over that? I mean, we know, I believe there's sensible policies in making housing more accessible by changing the negative gearing rules and the capital gains tax rules, as Bill Shorter said. But the Australian people don't seem to want it. So there is a sensible policy that will make housing much more available by inhibiting the motivation for the rich to buy more and more property, and therefore deny the others property. And we know it's there, I believe, and yet you're constrained because most people seem to want it to be a casino. So how do you, as politicians, deal with the logic of that as against the fact that people are going to vote against you? That's my question.
I'm calling time on your question.
I finished.
Thank you. Sorry, first with you.
It's a can of worms, but I'll take it. We have to have an honest conversation about this. To say the Australian people don't want to change it, I think says that people who have a voice want to change it, but then there's a lot of people who don't have a powerful voice in that debate that do, and many of those are young people. I think, and I have advocated for broad-based tax reform, which goes further than capital gains tax and negative gearing and stamp duty and all the various pieces of property. But I think that should be part of a broad-based tax review that takes a look at our over-reliance on income tax, the various levels of company tax, taxing of multinationals, and then how our current tax regime is affecting our property market. There are mechanisms that could be used that could be protective of people who are currently negative geared. Grandfathering has been discussed, just as an example, but there is no doubt, and we all know, that the current system is distorting our property market, and that will prevent our children from being able to buy homes anywhere near us. And this is something that we have to address.
I think rather than get everyone to answer every question.
I don't want to answer that.
I'm happy.
I'm just worried about other questions.
I mean, I'm happy to. It's a hard public, right? It's nice to see you. I've had a few cups of teas in Ron's house over the years, but no, it's a great question, and I did believe, I did try and advocate for the negative gearing policy and the capital gains discount policy at the last election. To give you a sense of the scale of this, each year the federal government spends between $12 and $15 billion on discounting people to have investment properties. And when you think about how much the federal government spends on providing housing and homelessness services or building affordable housing, it's a third of that. So it's clearly distorting it, as Zoe said, and whether or not negative gearing is the option, which I still think at some stage it will have to be addressed, and whether it's done in a grandfathered way or whether it's put on the table. I mean, I don't believe that elections are about one thing. I mean, I think elections are complex, and we did put it on the table twice and we got rejected twice. So you have to be honest about that. But I don't think that as new, as one of the things that happened in COVID, as new information happens and as new things come to light, you have to reassess things constantly. Inflation has caused interest rates to go up. People are having huge mortgage stress. I mean, the housing market is evolving, and I think we need to constantly be willing to have open and difficult conversations. And I'll probably get in trouble for this, but I think it's a great point, and I think that we have to be honest about what it's doing to the housing market.
I'd like to see more supply come online. I think that's another issue that we don't talk enough about. It does mean that we need to think about our cities changing a little bit. If you go to any of the major cities in the world, New York, London, Paris, these cities are vertical, and they are that way for a reason, because land is a premium. So, I think Australia, we've had this luxury of this abundance and of space that we've luxuriated in, but the time is arriving where we might need to collectively as a community make some decisions for the sake of our children and our grandchildren. And, by 2030, Australia's population is projected to hit around 30 million. So where are these people going to live? Now, my my game-changing idea, which I talked about in my main speech, was high-speed rail into our regions. Now, that's still going to be decades away, but it absolutely must happen to a country of this size, because once that happens, of course, the regions start coming closer to us. But in the interim, we need to think about how we can, whether we're comfortable seeing a reshaping of our cities.
To move the Jewish community back to Shepparton where it started.
I can project pretty well.
Okay, hi everybody. I'll stand up so I can see you all. My name's Aya. I actually live in Higgins, so it's lovely to see you here. I actually wanted to ask you, because all of you are in seats that were previously considered safe, and they're no longer like that. They're very marginal. I mean, not so much Victorian senating, but you know what I mean. There's clearly been a slide away from the two-party system in this election, and I wanted to ask, how is your perception of your electorate changing?
How is the perception of your electorate changing? And also, how are you going to represent those people who didn't vote for you?
Great question.
I know, James, it doesn't quite work like this in the Senate, but I'd be keen to hear your views on the changing face of the electorate.
Yeah, well, obviously there's a lot of lessons to learn for the Liberal Party out of this election, and one of them is that there are no safe seats for us anymore. If we ever thought that there were, we would have been disabused of that notion at this election, and so we really need to carefully study the implications of that, and that has implications for how you conduct yourself as a Member of Parliament for the length of your 3-year term and the way in which you spend your time. But it also has implications for how political parties spend the limited resources they have and where they choose to prioritise them. I think politics is generally becoming more volatile in Western democracies, and Australia's not immune from those trends. And just as we've had a big change election at this election, we could have a big change election at the next election, and it may be in our favour or it may be against us again. And it's very hard to predict those trends. But some things are kind of constant in politics, which is that there is a premium for people who are locally connected and engaged, with people who are accessible and visible in their communities, people who know the issues in the local neighbourhoods and are able to kind of target down and make sure those people feel heard and represented. And no matter what's happening in politics, if as a local Member of Parliament you're doing those things, you're giving yourself the best chance possible of earning the support of your community again to continue to represent them.
Michelle?
So in Higgins was sort of bucked the trend a little nationally, as you know. So the Labor vote went up, the Liberal vote went, we took votes off the Liberals and we took votes off the Greens. So the only way I got over the line is because Conservatives, lifelong Conservatives, vote to Labor. That's the only way, bottom line. And that's extraordinary for these people. And they told me, they came outside and they basically told me quietly that they had voted for me, and it was a huge honour. And I saw a lot of that happen. I would agree that, of course, you must remain connected to your local community and listen to their needs. I don't think there's any question that that needs to happen. But I think there's a deeper problem here. For too long, the predicament we are currently in, the economic, environmental, and even health crisis that we are in, is largely driven by short-termism. All right? This country has not really invested in a generational kind of way. We have been poor ancestors, to put it bluntly. Now, that all must change. And it was, in fact, a Jewish researcher, Jonas Salk, who invented the polio vaccine, who said that we must be better ancestors. Now, I would say to my colleagues, and certainly on our side of the government, we are trying to invest for the long term in Australia, bringing back onshore manufacturing, for example, investing, getting this climate bill through so that we transition this country over a decade or less to renewable energy. And even secure work protections are going to pay dividends for young people, for women, for minority groups, for essential workers, and so on and so forth. So I would say to the Australian people that our electoral cycle forces politicians to think short term, right? But actually it is a rod for our backs, and we need to penalise that kind of thinking and reward the thinking that invests for a generation, actually 7 generations.
go to some other questions. This gentleman over there.
In the discussion you were having about the recent conflict with Islamic Jihad, I got a sense of moral equivalence from some members of the panel. Is that what you were trying to say? That it was an equal conflict on both sides. That sense. That they were both equally contributing to the conflict.
I don't know if any of the members of the panel want to address that, because I'm not sure who is meant to have said that. I didn't detect that, but I'm not going to demand that anyone who answer that question.
Look, it clearly wasn't. Like clearly, and you know, it's worth saying, David, that it clearly wasn't. I mean, one group was firing indiscriminately into civilian areas, and one group was trying to target militants, and there was, you know, in the indiscriminate fire, there was kids caught up in that, as well as children caught in the attacks on militants. So it clearly wasn't equal, and nor should there be moral equivalence drawn. But I do think it is, and I do think it is worth pointing out that minimising conflict in all shapes and forms is really important. And as a Jewish community, I think that that's something we hold really dear. And I'm not sure if it was my comments, but the thing I was really trying to put out there was, I actually think that the leadership of Israel are trying to project that they were trying to minimise this conflict was actually a really smart diplomatic move, and I thought it was important as well.
David Siegel is my name, and this is probably for Josh and for Michelle. Whilst I have every confidence in both of you in terms of support for Israel and in relation to Israel and Palestine, you have a junior partner called the Greens, who have a history of less than full support for Israel and questionable support for Palestinians. Do you feel that I, as a Jew, should have some concerns about that relationship that you have at the moment?
Can I start? David, thank you for the question. And as someone who almost lost their political career to the Greens, I take great umbrage to it. No, I mean, we are a majority government. We have 77 seats in the House of Representatives. We are not in coalition, and we are a Labor government, and I'm really proud to be a part of it. Let me also say, though, I do think, and this maybe goes to A's question as well. We got an increase in Labor's vote in McNamara, which I feel very appreciative. If you did support me, thank you. But really, especially my wife's very grateful that I've got something to do during the day. But we didn't get every vote, and we have to be humble about that. And I actually think that one of the things that the Australian people really asked for was to work along different party lines on issues that confront our country. And we've had a great discussion tonight about some of those issues. And the Labor Party, as much as I am affiliated and connected and believe in the institution that is the Australian Labor Party, I really do, about the reform it can bring for this country. We are not the arbiter of all good ideas, and there are other good contributions to be made. I think the contribution of the independents around the climate bill was really important, and I acknowledge Zoe on that, and I think we should have more of that. And I think that the Greens, if government wants to engage with them on issues, then that's fine, and there's a lot of people who voted for them, and we have to respectfully engage with them. Now, does that mean we agree with them on foreign policy? No. Their stuff on China is completely insane, and their argument to halve our defence budget, I think, is really short-sighted. Now, does that mean we want to spend all our money on defence? Of course not, but it's a reality of our strategic issues that confront our nation. So, we are a Labor government. We're in majority. We're not in coalition with these people, and there are things that we will work together with them on, and there are things that we'll have serious disagreements on. But I do think, more broadly after this election, what the Australian people actually want, David, is to try and get things done and to work across party lines in the Parliament in the interest of all Australians.
Yes. It's time to hear from a woman, please. Mum. Thank you. Thank you. I'd like to address this to any and all of the forum here. Less than 2 weeks ago, I had a phone call from a principal who, in conversation with me, mentioned that the day before he had 19 staff away in his primary school, and that day he had 14 away. I'd be interested to hear if any of the constituents in your areas have voiced to you any ideas about how to attend to the education crisis we have, and also your own personal views about how we can improve the teaching status that we have in our society.
I might have a quick go and then answer. Look, I absolutely hear you in relation to schools. Yes, schools have been giving me the same feedback as well, and it's a particularly acute problem, I think, for teachers, but it's actually a problem across the whole economy and society at the moment. If you talk to someone who runs a hospital, they say the same thing. If you talk to someone who runs a small business in manufacturing or retail or hospitality, they say the same thing. There's a lot of wonderful things about having a 3.5% unemployment rate, and we should all celebrate what that means for people who have employment for the first time in a long time, and how that's enriched them. But it does mean that we have a really quite serious crisis, particularly in some skilled areas of the workers that we need to do the things that make our society function. Now obviously part of that is a hangover from COVID and 2 years of border closures, effectively 18 months of border closures, and it will take quite a while before that backlog is addressed and that gets up and running again, and some of those shortages will be able to be filled. But actually that's not going to fix it on its own. There are other things we need to do. One of the things that my party has talked about since we lost the election is allowing pensioners to work more before their pension is reduced if they want to. So currently, you can only earn $300 in a fortnight as a pensioner before your pension starts to reduce, and we've said that should be doubled so that a retired teacher can come back into the workforce if they want for a couple of days a week to help fill some of those gaps in the workforce. So I think that would make a difference in the short term as well.
Can I comment? So, infectious diseases doctor, I've worked on the front line. I was there during the Omicron wave at the Alfred. I would be comfortable with pensioners taking up the slack, provided I was confident that they were actually going to be safe at work, because the most powerful risk factor for mortality with COVID is age. All right, it's the most powerful risk factor. Right now, this pandemic is not actually over. I know we'd like to think it's over, but it's not actually over. And the pandemic, the virus doesn't care for our feelings at all, or our ideology, or our cultural wars. Right now, we have ongoing infections. We have repeated infections. I am gravely worried, particularly around young people, people of working age who are getting repeated infections. I have young people in their 20s, constituents of mine, who have cardiac problems. Right? They're on cardiac medications. That is not normal. That is not normal in any universe. So I am going to be, working, and I'm already starting with my colleagues on the Labor side to see what we can do to try and apply downward pressure to this pandemic and to these recurrent infections. And one of the things, I can see a few people here wearing masks, but the other thing, of course, is ventilation. This virus has spread through the air, and for too long we have not had national guidelines on improving the air quality. So we take water quality very seriously, but not air quality, and that has to change. This pandemic has shown us that that needs to change, particularly because there will likely be another virus and another virus after that because of climate change.
Can I make a comment? I know in part the question is about workforce shortages, and that's across a range of industries, but I think that there's a deeper issue going on in teaching, and certainly this is something that people have raised with me not only in recent weeks but in recent months. My father was a teacher and then a headmaster at a public primary school in Tasmania, and I think I've seen an evolution of teaching over my lifetime. The time that teachers have to spend doing administrative duties, paperwork, planning school camps and things like that, rather than actually teaching students, has really become counterbalanced against job satisfaction. And I think that if we want to, leaving COVID aside, if we want to get people into teaching, we have to make teaching a more attractive profession. As someone who's worked extensively in developing countries, I have a strong view that education is power. If we don't have a strong education system, especially from early childhood up, then we will be disempowered as a country. And I think we should have a clear laser focus on that. And speaking of building new relationships with Israel, one thing that Israel has shown great promise on and innovation in is education. And I think that is a relationship area that we should be building.
Well, lots of questions, I think. Are we out of time, or one more?
My question, panel, relates to The Voice. I'm for The Voice, but I know quite a few people who are not. Part of it... Oh, did you hear me? I'm concerned about a number of people who are not sympathetic to the idea of The Voice. I am very positive for The Voice, but I fear that it might founder unless it becomes just a little clearer in the way in which it is presented. It's not helped by a couple of your colleagues, one Liberal, one Green, who are quite antithetical to The Voice. So it's poisoning the debate somewhat. What can you convey to us that would be a good message to be able to convince people that The Voice, not only its time has come, but also that there is a very well-founded argument for it, and it's not a concern, it's not a threat, but it will be a good.
Can I answer that with a question, with an example? So let me give you an example. You may have heard of the Raising the Age campaign. So right now in Australia, in juvenile detention facilities, there are children as young as 10 in incarceration, and our First Nations children are actually overrepresented. So there's been a campaign waged over many years to raise that age to 14 so that we don't lock young children up in these sorts of facilities. This campaign has floundered, and it's floundered because it's never politically expedient to drive this kind of legislation through. For whatever reason, there are other priorities and it gets bumped. So something like a voice to Parliament will mean that this doesn't get bumped, all right? Important reforms like this that will have a material impact on the lives of our young children, Australia's children, our First Nations children, and indeed non-First Nations children, will be put back on the agenda, and politicians like us have to pay attention. There is no turning away. There is no averting the eyes to this kind of crisis. So The Voice is not about, as my understanding, it is like an advisory. It is not about a third chamber. It is not. It will not have the ability to legislate. We remain the legislators in the country, but we are forced to listen and take heed of what our First Nations are actually asking of us. With respect to the dissenting parliamentarians, I would say to you that these people do not speak for all First Nations people. All right, like myself and like everyone here, we represent cohorts. I represent Higgins, Jacinta represents her own electorate, and so does Lydia Thorpe. They do not speak for the whole First Nations. The Uluru Statement was created by 12 dialogues, which brought together First Nations community, disparate nations, to our country. The process of consultation has already been done, and it is now 5 years old. It is waiting for us and for people of goodwill and good faith to deliver that now.
The last question goes to you. Yes.
Okay. Just to bring up some past incidents.
No, if it's a question.
No, it'll be a question. It's to do with Zoe Daniel not removing her signature from the Do Better on Palestine letter. Let me finish. I'm hoping that Zoe, as my representative in Goldstein, has become more sympathetic to Israel and its issues and why there is no Palestinian state. And also, Zoe, did you read in The Age about the Melbourne University Student Union doubling down on anti-Semitism with a fresh motion to boycott Israel? Did you read it in The Age a couple of days ago, and what do you think of it?
thank you for that question.
Nice to see you again.
You ran a fantastic campaign.
Thank you.
Tim Wilson's campaign was. I told them so.
I won't labour the point on this. I did read about Melbourne University Student Union. I don't agree with their position. I wouldn't think that that's any surprise. In regard to the letter that I signed, my position was made very clear during the election campaign. My position has not changed. I signed the letter for a reason. I was a foreign correspondent, and I believe that media should be able to operate without being targeted during conflict. But I'm here to genuinely engage, and I will continue to be. And as I've said on this panel, my position is exactly the same as both major parties in regard to safety and security for people of Israel. But my aim by being here is to represent you, those of you who live in Goldstein and are members of my community, authentically and genuinely within the Parliament, and that's what I'll always strive to do.
I'm going to now take a seat, and Yossi Goldfarb is going to take the mic.
Thanks, Gabby. And before I start with just a few closing remarks, if you could all just thank Gabby and the panel